Thank you very much. I was asked to speak about education and inequality, and I will use that theme to discuss the challenge of education for all. Education is by far the single most empowering investment imaginable for individuals, as David Bloom discussed in the last session. And it's for that reason that we have long regarded education as a basic human need and as a basic human right. And yet we have not achieved that. And I want to discuss that this morning. We are in the knowledge economy. And of course, this knowledge-based economy will only intensify in the years ahead. The essence of a knowledge-based economy is that knowledge reaps the returns in the marketplace, whereas raw labor loses the returns in the marketplace. People without an education cannot earn a livelihood above poverty. This is a basic point, and it will become increasingly intensively evident in the years ahead. Agriculture will be mechanized almost everywhere. Mining has been essentially mechanized. Many low-skilled jobs that at least provided a basic livelihood have been mechanized or now will be substituted by artificial intelligence and other expert systems. In the United States, what's shown here is the vast opening of inequality according to educational attainment. Indeed, America has become two societies, essentially. If you have a bachelor's degree or higher, life has never been better in material terms. If you have a high school degree or lower, life has become very difficult. The widening of income inequality explains almost everything about the basic sociological patterns of the United States, the political divides, the economic divides, the loss of trust in society. And so education has become the defining point of a decent life. And one of the most striking findings of recent 2 decades is that people with less education are dying now at much higher rates. We have an epidemic of so-called deaths of despair, but it is only hitting populations with high school or less education in the United States. Those with college education or more, essentially unchanged trends. So what's shown here are the rising deaths due to drugs, alcohol, and suicide. Those rising trends are for people with high school degrees or less. The trends on the bottom are those with the 4-year college degree or more. It's two societies. And this will become true everywhere. Children without an education will not have a viable future, period. It's also the case, and David summarized it, that educational attainment is strongly related to economic progress. And the correlation of test score quality and economic growth has been shown in repeated studies, and I'm just repeating one of these correlations. On the horizontal axis is the test scores, and on the vertical axis is the growth rate. It's a so-called partial regression line. And this is a very powerful relationship. So it's not surprising that education has been recognized as a basic need and therefore a basic human right. What is a human right? A human right is something that every individual is afforded on the basis of human dignity, just on the simple fact of being a human being. And education has been recognized as a human right for 72 years, since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I want to emphasize that because we have failed for 72 years to realize those rights. There has been progress. I'm always much more interested in the failure than the progress, I have to say, because the failure is our urgency, and we have fallen short of a global commitment made 72 years ago. But not only 72 years ago, we keep repeating the same commitment each generation, deciding it's new, very excitedly going forward, and failing again. So I want to explain why that is, because it's a very basic reason. As everybody knows, Einstein's famous definition of insanity, or at least attributed to him, is to keep doing the same thing and expecting a different result. This is how we are in the global context. There's a certain lack of seriousness in how we approach these commitments. So Article 26 of the Universal Declaration says everyone has the right to education. Education shall be free, at least in the elementary and fundamental stages. Elementary education shall be compulsory, and so forth. It also said it should be directed to the full development of the human personality, integral human development. So this is so much already part of our global commitment, but not realized since 1948. In the UN Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, it says the state parties recognize the right of everyone to education. They agree that education shall be directed to the full development of the human personality. Then they say primary education shall be compulsory and available free to all. Secondary education shall be made generally available and accessible to all by every appropriate means, and in particular by the progressive introduction of free education. That's 54 years ago. The world's gotten incomparably richer since then, but we have not achieved Article 13. Then came Article 28, 31 years ago, and the Convention of the Rights of the Child. State parties recognized the right of the child to education, primary education compulsory and available for all. It's the same language. It's literally doing the same thing each generation and not getting the results. This is where we are today. Now we call them Sustainable Development Goals. I'm not a cynic. I spend every waking hour working towards the SDGs, I have to say. So I'm not meaning to be cynical. I'm just meaning to say that we're 72 years into this, and we need to understand this. So the SDGs say ensure that all girls and boys complete free, equitable, and quality primary and secondary education. It's a kind of advance. Now, secondary education should be free. This is now not, we will try to make it free. Now, in 2015, it should be free. Also added, thanks to great work by Hiro Yoshikawa and many colleagues, it's recognized globally that there should be quality early childhood development. So now we talk about universal pre-K. This is extremely important. Technical skills, equal access for men and women, eliminating gender disparities. And I do want to highlight what I regard also as something we've been talking about for 72 years, but put very well as SDG 4.7. By 2030, ensure that all learners acquire the knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development, including, among others, through education for sustainable development and sustainable lifestyles. This is what Ram has called for, education for sustainable development. It's a global goal. It's a UN goal. Every country has subscribed to it. But also human rights, gender equality, promotion of a culture of peace and nonviolence, global citizenship and appreciation of cultural diversity and of culture's contribution to sustainable development. Quite wonderful. Wouldn't it be nice? But we have continuing shortfalls of global educational attainment. So the net attendance, that is school-age children divided by, or school-age enrollments divided by school-age children, is less than 50% in significant parts of Africa, for example, and in Afghanistan. That's at the primary level, mind you. And still less than 70 or 80% in many, many countries of the world. Expected years of schooling are between 4 and 8 years across the Sahel of Africa, and between 8 and 12 years in most of Africa. Shockingly low. UNESCO has published last year data showing that currently only 41% of children in low-income countries are completing lower secondary education, and only 19% completing upper secondary education. This is supposed to be 100% by 2030, but it's 19% now. And on the current trends, this would be 26% by 2030. So let's get serious. We can't train and educate for the full human being if the children aren't even in school. And for more than 3/4 of the children, in fact, more than 4/5 in upper secondary, they're not in school, not completing an upper secondary education. There is a strong correlation as well, not surprisingly, between income per capita, or the amount invested per child in education, and the learning measured on standardized international tests. Children in poor countries don't learn. Sometimes they don't even gain the most basic skills of literacy and numeracy. Often children in grade 5 or grade 6 cannot read even basic text, and we're going to hear from Radhika Iyengar, my wonderful colleague who works in villages across Asia and Africa, about the incredibly poor outcomes, but the investments are startlingly low. Currently, it's estimated that there are 260 million school-age children out of school, roughly half in sub-Saharan Africa, half of those in sub-Saharan Africa. The numbers are coming down, but not with any sense of urgency, and I would say almost with no international input. If they're coming down because of local development, not because of anything the world community is doing. There is no world community, by the way. It is a nice saying, but there's no community at the global level. At least I'm looking for it in every nook and cranny. I can't find it right now, and we're not making progress because of global action. Now, why is this? Because poverty is real. Because poor people lack the resources within the families, within the communities, and in the governments of low-income settings to provide a basic education for all. This is just basic budgeting. Let me give you an example. What is the cost of educating a student? Minimum cost. Well, I just looked up the average salary for a teacher in Mali. It's about $590 a month. So something on the order of $5,000 to $6,000 a year. By the way, with that salary, it's very hard to get them in the north, in the rural areas. Insecurity, no place to live, and so on. But say it's $5,000. And say you have a class of 25 children in the class. Then per capita, that would be $200 per student. And just roughly speaking, to keep things simple. Teacher salaries are about half the expenditure of an education system. So that means roughly $400 per capita. That's how I come up with this number. There was an Education Finance Commission which spent 2 years and thousands of person hours, and they came up with the same number. I prefer the back of the envelope. I could have told them at the beginning, and I have to admit I did tell them at the beginning. You don't need to do this. This is simple. You don't need to get the Brookings Institution working for 2 years to make such and such number. This is something that is self-evident, and it is, by the way. So $400 per student, it's about right. We could argue whether it's $300 or $500. In the United States, we'll spend $10,000 to $15,000 per student, just to give you round numbers. But minimum $400. Now, if you look at a low-income setting, because of the demography that David Bloom spoke about 40% of the children, say age 4 to 18, but I use 5 to 19 because that's how the UN data come packaged, are about 40% of the population. The youth bulge. Now you want to educate all of them. That means the per capita cost, not per student, but per population, is 40% of $400. That's $160. I'm saving you the cost of running a whole commission for 5 years to estimate this. It's really very simple. Then you look at the per capita income. $800. That's roughly the per capita income of Mali or Niger or Chad or Ethiopia or Rwanda and so on. Well, a country at $800 per capita collects in tax revenues about 20% of GDP. That means the government has available about $160 per capita. Oh, that's what you need for education alone. This is why you can't educate all the children, because you can't afford it. Because that minister of finance also has to fund the education, the health system, has to fund the public administration, has to fund the police, has to fund water, sanitation, power, and other infrastructure. And so it turns out you can only devote maybe 15, 20, maybe 25% of your budget to education. Maybe 4 or 5% of GDP in a low-income country if you're really completely focused on this. And that will not cover the most basic education needs. So what happens? What happens is the president says we'd love to have SDG 4, but we cannot provide classrooms after the 9th year. Households are on their own. We can't afford it. And even up to the 9th year, between the 7th to the 9th year, very tough. And so we end up with 20% completion rates. This is not a mystery. This is just poverty. So there are two theories. The theory of the rich and powerful is you're poor, that's tough. Get rich. Don't look at me. Or the theory of decency, which is we're going to leave 260 million kids without an education. We should do something about it. You can guess which one I'm in favor of. So the IMF, I worked with the IMF this past year to make detailed budget numbers. I'm going to tell you, not a confession, just a secret. I said at the beginning to the head of the Fiscal Affairs Department, here's the number you're going to come up with at the end of the year. He devoted beautifully a department to this, 5 countries, detailed studies, came up just by my luck exactly to the number I gave. And then he came up to me at the end, because he's a lovely person, a former finance minister of Portugal. He said, Jeff, I didn't believe you. You were exactly right. There is no deep art to this. This is just basics of basic budgeting. So what the IMF found is if the poor countries are to meet the SDGs, not just education, but education, health, and basic infrastructure, there's about a $358 billion a year gap. Now that may sound like a lot to you, but it shouldn't. Because the next rule of macroeconomics is always know the right denominator. The denominator of interest for you is two main numbers. The world output each year is $100 trillion. The output of the rich countries is $50 trillion, half of the world output. So if you divide 358 billion per year by world output, that is 0.4 of 1% of world output is the financing gap for health, education, water, sanitation, power, and roads of 59 low-income countries with the 1.7 billion people. In other words, nothing. If we cared at all, this is utterly solvable. And since the rich countries are half of that total, just double it. It's 0.8 of 1% of the rich world income to close the financing gap of all the SDGs for the low-income countries. UNESCO has made very valuable contributions to this costing, more precise than my back of the envelope, but they come to the same number. And UNESCO has found that for Africa, out of a global financing gap of around 40 billion per year, Africa is about 26 billion per year to put all African children into school up through upper secondary level. Okay? Currently, development aid from the rich countries for primary and secondary education is coming to $13 per child. You can divide that by the $400 per child that's needed. You can see we're not cutting it. They like to check the box. Each country gives for education. We've done it. We're nice. Aren't we good? But nobody does basic arithmetic in the rich countries, in the donor agencies, to say, well, that's not going to do it. These are placeholders. They're not real policies. Okay, how could we raise $26 billion per year? Again, as a macroeconomist, it's an embarrassingly small number. I'm the last macroeconomist to be dealing in billions of dollars. My colleagues think I'm ridiculous because they're all dealing with trillions of dollars. Jeff, what are you wasting your time on billions of dollars? So 26 billion, it is 0.0005 of the GDP of the rich countries, or 0.05%. Half of 1/10 of 1%, we would get every child in Africa into school. Half of 1/10 of 1% of the income of the rich world. It is 1.7% of the annual arms spending, which is $1.5 trillion. It is 2 weeks of the US military budget to put every child in school. I keep telling the Pentagon, take a summer vacation. Take a break, relax. Don't go to war this month. We'd easily have enough. We'd easily have enough to do this. Now, how about this? 5 people right now, 5 people have $500 billion of wealth. 5 people. I didn't say 5 countries. 5 people. Jeff Bezos this morning, $124 billion. $124 billion. Bill Gates, $110 billion. Bernard Arnault, Warren Buffett, Mark Zuckerberg, round off the list. Now, you can safely say that when you're in that category, you're going to earn at least a 5% rate of return on your portfolio. 5% of $500 billion is $25 billion. 5 people could fund the education for every child in Africa from primary through secondary school. 5 people. We need a fund to do this. And I travel the world nonstop trying to raise the money. It's not simple, even though it's tiny. But here are where we're going to get the funds. The donor governments that would have to give 0.5%, the European Union as a union, major philanthropists, and I've spoken with 3 recently, and there's an interest in funding education. I was at the Islamic Development Bank a couple of days ago. They're interested. They have a program, get every child out of school into school in the Islamic countries, in their member states. A great partner. UNESCO, UNICEF, and other UN agencies. The International Monetary Fund, where we heard strongly from the managing director yesterday, her complete commitment to this agenda. The SDG advocates of UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, I'm privileged to be one of them. We can get all of the advocates working for this. Global Citizen is a global NGO for the SDGs. It's got many of the most famous rock stars in the world and performing artists. And then youth, Greta Thunberg and others, ready to join. Pope Francis is our greatest mobilizer for decency in the world. And when Pope Francis calls for a global compact for education, let us use the occasion to mobilize the basic financing so that this is real, not only so that it is a great ideal, but so the kids get in school. And I believe if we recommend to Pope Francis that with his leadership, which is unique in the world, we will go out to find these funds. Each of us will go knock on the door of our favorite billionaire, our next door neighbors, people who can make a difference. We will get this done. Even by May, I've spoken with some of the world's wealthiest people. They want to be here for this occasion. But I think we need a clarity that part of the goal is not only the wonderful aim of the improved content, but actually making sure that children have a school room and a seat so that they can benefit from that wonderful content. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff. Wonderful, wonderful presentation. The memorable quote is, $1 billion isn't what it used to be. And Jeff, I have a proposal for you. Let's have a division of labor. Half live in your state, the other half live in my state. So let's join forces.
Bravo.
Thank you, thank you. This is the pact on how to talk to our neighbors.
I think we have 46 billionaires within a radius of a mile of where we live, so I'm happy to go door to door.
Likewise in the west side of LA. Thank you so much.